We will witness the conversation between Michael and Stephen as they examine this. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards. Please help yourself to the lunchies and hot or cold beverages. The coffee is okay, very good. And everybody's nicely settled. And so to begin this journey, gentlemen, what has been the motivation and the triggers for your lifelong learning?
I'm just going to get a little more settled if you don't mind.
So I'm going to be the non-inebriated. Nice to see everybody here. Nice to see everybody on cyberspace, and welcome to this spontaneous and unscripted event. You know, in thinking these answers, there's so many different things you can go into, and what we've done, we kind of put it into some themes and didn't want to go beyond like about 15 minutes for each theme. But I guess, you know, there's triggers for, you know, I just put down a few notes here about triggers for lifelong learning. You know, I was thinking about that today, and I guess I have to try to keep things simple, because when I teach trainees, I give them paradigms and that help them to learn things as simply as possible so that they can retain that and apply it. And I think for me, I would say that there's two triggers. One is compulsory and one is voluntary. Because as a doctor, you're required to do lifelong learning that is mandatory, number one, to keep your license within Ontario and every province or jurisdiction. And secondly, you have to maintain some continuing education for your specialty area. So we have two different organizations that require slightly different things in terms of the ongoing education, and this is compulsory. So we have to have a certain number of credits in different types of learning. So it really gets us exposure to self-learning rounds and lectures and so on, journal reading and so on, and research, which we get credit for. And that's the compulsory learning that we're required to do. And then there's the more enjoyable, which is the just the word. If I had to say, you could probably guess the word I'm going to use, but for all of us, when we enjoy learning new things or going to places to learn or to read or whatever mode you're going to use, what is that stimulates all of us to learn new things? The word starts with a C. Curiosity. So that's been my lifelong learning of curiosity from many different sources. Are you now a little tipsy now, or are you ready to
Give me one more sip.
Curiosity.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
So I think that's a wonderful segue into my comments, because I think it's the basis for both me and Stephen in terms of where we begin with the trigger or the motivation to further indulge in education. And over the years, I've come to appreciate really a couplet of elements of personality that for me are the stimulus for educating myself and to translate it, sharing that with others. And that is, besides curiosity, the word that comes together with that, as far as my experience has been, is humility. And I'll explain what I mean by that. We shared an interpretation of the first part of Pirkei Avot this past Shabbat. And it says, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. It talks about Moses receiving Torah, not at Sinai, from Sinai. What does that mean, Moses received Torah from Sinai? Sinai offered Moses the Torah. Sinai offered Moses instruction. It's our understanding that Moses received that from God. So rather than use the preposition at or on, it uses the preposition from, because there's a beautiful midrash that talks about Sinai as not being the mightiest, the most impressive, or the tallest of mountains, but a humble mountain, one that didn't necessarily stand out from others. And God was choosing a place at which Torah might be offered to Moses and transmitted thereafter to the children of Israel, God picked Mount Sinai for that reason, because of the humble nature, the humility that Mount Sinai showed, the fact that unlike other mountains mentioned, that we can identify them supposedly in Israel today or in the surroundings, did not claim, did not get out there and brag about being the most meritorious of mountains from which Torah should be offered. Sinai said nothing, was quiet, and therefore God chose Sinai. So when it says that Moses received Torah from Sinai, Moses received the understanding that in order to be able to receive education, in order to be able to receive instruction and teaching, you have to start from a place of humility. And why? If you understand and experience humility, then you have an awareness that there are others among you that may be better than you, that can offer you something that you don't have. So starting from humility means that you don't see yourself as a never. That's not what I'm saying. It's saying that you understand the opposite of arrogance. It means you have something to learn. It means you don't know it all. You don't have it all. You don't display it all. And if you start from that element of humility, then curiosity kicks in. Because if you understand that there's something else out there besides yourself, then you are naturally curious to learn about what that other element is. And I'm not sure if curiosity and humility are a chicken and egg. You might start from curiosity. And if you begin from a basis of curiosity, then you understand that there is something else out there. If you're curious, it means you're aware that there's something else out there to learn. And wherever you start from, curiosity or humility, that's the basis from which you become a good student. That's the basis on which you can receive and understand the value of teaching received from others. And before you can do anything else, you have to understand that you have things to learn. So you need to start from that element of humility. You need to be curious about what's out there. And I won't go into the other stages that Pirkei Avot talks about, what makes an effective student, because for me, it's always been that initial stage. If I can attain a sufficient level of humility and curiosity, then literally the world is out there. It's available. You just have to find ways to approach that and appeal to that and make it appealing to yourself. But those are the basis and the foundation for my interest and I'd say dedication to ongoing learning from that point.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, I can remember one thing you mentioned, Mike, was the humility. And a lot of you know that there's in the Talmud, there are debates that go on and on and on for 2,900 pages or so. But some of the more famous ones are between two schools of thought, the basis of Shammai, the house of Shammai, and the house of Hillel. Now, they argue about various points, and almost all of the decisions that are made are in favor of why. And it just picks up on a point that Mike was saying. And the paradigm of why it's most of the time, by the way, does anybody know how many times, Mike, how many times the vote is actually according to Shammai? It's a trivia question. How many times of the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of decisions does it actually go to Shammai? There are actually a few. Carol,
I'm not.
PhD sister here. It's actually six. There's six occasions where, sorry, six that go according to Shammai. But the reason it goes on, the reason they say it goes according to Hillel is because Hillel would always present the argument of Shammai before they were all he would present his own. And then there was a decision made who would go according to, but Shammai apparently didn't do that. Shammai declared what they were deciding, whereas Hillel would do the preface by giving the Shammai answer before. And this is a paradigm that I've always used. Whenever I give a lecture or I've written a paper of any kind, I always acknowledge what has gone on as part of the scientific paradigm is that you acknowledge the literature that's gone before you, and you have to prove that what you have is something that's pushing the envelope before it will get accepted by a journal. But in any presentation, I always present the alternative side. So that's part of the ethic or ethos of our medical practice and research, is to always present other people's views and maybe contrary views, and then what your decision is based on what the previous people have come up with. And when you're in a debate on a panel, that's exactly how it's done. You always acknowledge and say, I appreciate what you're saying, and summarize it, and then you go on and give your own, rather than trying to be dogmatic and overpowering somebody else on that. So I've always felt that that humility is the way you do that, and you get much better reception. That's the thing. You create a dialogue, which is the part of COVID, of course, but you create a dialogue between that person and you, and allows you to learn. So I thought I've learned a whole lot from this guy, and you've always been the most sort of humble and in your very effective way of getting things done in the school, just in a very humble way, and that's why people are attracted to you. I think it's credit to your character and that you get effective things done, but in a humble way, and acknowledge people's talents, even though you push them to exceed the envelope, but always in a very humble way. And I think that's a great set.
Well, since you're offering my opinion first, does that mean I'm Beit Shammai and but it's as if it's prescriptive. I want to pick up on that point, because when we talk about triggers, first of all, thank you very much for those generous comments, and you know, of course, they're mutual.
Well, did everybody here?
So we talked about certain values. I think it's Stephen and I share, which give us a trigger for motivation to ongoing education. But I think we also need daily triggers beyond the grandiose values. And so in my office, when students and their families come, and especially when I'm meeting with the bar mitzvah family before, sometime a year before their ceremony, somebody asked me, have you read all the books in your office? And before I respond to that question, there's one shelf behind me that for me is the trigger for this curiosity and humility, and tying in what Stephen said with relation to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and respecting the opinions of others. So on the back shelf behind me, I have a collection of texts from, not every, of course, but from many, a variety of faith communities and civilizational, cultural expressions. So, of course, we have a few different versions of Torah and its interpretation, but there are also there's a Christian Bible there, and specifically the one, somebody said this to me, I won't mention who said it to me. They asked me, why do you have the Bible translated by Martin Luther? Don't you know that he was an anti-Semite and he professed things against? And I said, you've answered your own question. Because having that translation in my office makes me aware that there are other ways of looking at our tradition that may be similar to mine, or interpretations of those texts that are vastly different from the way I interpret. And so, besides the Christian Bibles, I also have copies of the Quran, the Vedas, Hindu faith, elements from the Baha'i faith, and a whole variety of others, because whether or not I read those on a daily basis, disclosure, I see them there, and they inspire me to two things. Number one, they bring me back to the point of humility, because I'm not familiar with those anywhere near that I would like to be even familiar with our own tradition. And so it gives me pause for a moment to think, we have our understanding, we're educated about our own tradition. But if we remain only in that bubble without exposing ourselves to other civilizations and faith communities, then we don't know how to encounter with those in meaningful and relevant dialogue. If you don't understand what others believe and what others see as value in terms of their cultural expression, then you can't have a relevant and effective encounter with them, as effective as it might be. And so that shelf, I would say that pretty much every day, because that's the first thing I see when I come into my office before I sit down. I see that, and it reminds me that there's so much more to be aware of if I want to be able to enter into good dialogue with others who may think otherwise. And I'll push the envelope a little further. On another shelf, I have a series of narratives that particularly today are relevant. Today's May the 15th. And yesterday, 75 years ago, which we've talked about, the state of Israel in the Gregorian calendar was declared, which was a couple of weeks ago in the calendar this year. But today is Nakba. And when I say that word, I know a lot of people cringe. They say, why would you even mention that? That's the Palestinian experience. Why is that of interest to you? And I say that because part of being curious and humble is understanding that we have a narrative, not just of our own experience, but sometimes of shared experiences. And if we don't acknowledge, I'm not saying you have to agree, I'm not saying you have to believe, but if you don't acknowledge the existence of other narratives for an experience that we shared, then you don't understand your own experience sufficiently. You may not, as I said, it may be very distasteful to you, it may cause provocation, it may cause you to get very angry and indignant. But that's not an excuse for ignorance. And whether or not you see the narratives of others, and not just in the Israeli context, in many others, there are different narratives of the Bible, whether it's the Jewish Bible, the Christian Bible, or any other interpretation. If you don't acknowledge that there are other ways of interpreting, there are other narratives and understandings of experiences in which we were involved with others, regardless of the causes. We're not talking about blame. We're talking about understanding how people see a shared experience. If you're not able to do that, then similar to dialogue with other faith communities, you can't have any genuine dialogue or resolution of misunderstanding if you're not willing to acknowledge whether you agree with it or not, or fully recognize it with others whose experience has been different.
Following up on that, Mike, I guess we should acknowledge that we are on the lands of the indigenous people who have usually inhabited this land before, and we acknowledge their long-standing history here. I mean, it's something we discussions. You know, I was. Well, did you want to, or did you want us to continue on another tab?
In keeping with the flow.
You mean we've gone beyond the 10 minutes allotted?
Actually, it was 15 minutes. I think you alluded. But carrying on from that, I'd like to know who were your mentors and what influences in your lives have stimulated you along the way.
Well, I'll tell you, reading up on what Mike has said. No, because it's a combination answer. That there are mentors who stimulated my interests in various areas along the way and challenged me along the way. But I was also going to say, when you talked about humility and about looking beyond what we were taught. I think, I mean, I have to acknowledge that I don't know if it's God-driven or just by luck, but over the years, I've read at least a couple of hundred books that have shed light on the events in the Bible. That's what stimulated my interest in science and the Bible, because my mentors from way back, the rabbis I had chat and associated, were very knowledgeable. We were really, and Mike will probably attest to this, that at chat it was a very monolithic type of teaching in terms of orthodox, neo-orthodox kind of upbringing, if you want to put it. And we used to have an Ask the Rabbi session, and there were certain subjects that they would refuse to go into. And one of them was the book of Genesis. It was something that was not contraband, it was something that just wasn't something that they discussed. And we did learn in grade 1 and 2, and Eve, and about Abraham, Terah, and so on, in a very, very superficial way about Noah. But I always thought there has to be some element, for instance, of truth in what is in those books, because it's in several different books of several different nationalities and ethnicities. And the fact that the rabbis and the teachers that I had didn't want to go there meant that I had to go there. I just said, there's got to be an answer. And over the years, I have read, as Mike was saying, the religious text side, I'm going into the side of secular texts that dealt with the history of the world, history of the Middle East, history, geological, biochemical, hydrological. There's all kinds of books about what went on in the previous year that just seemed to gel with what the Bible was saying. That no one had ever referred me to. I just happened to be seeing these books appear in different bookstores and so on, and go look for them. And so, you know, just looking at things outside has been, from this challenge back from those days, I just found it was just absolutely piquing my curiosity that I had to find out. So it was kind of the non-answers that were that stimulated. But there were people along the way. Mike and I share a very strong interest in grammar, biblical grammar. And that was, we had a principal, Jack Burke of Al Shalom, who was our principal in the junior high and senior high. And he used to come in, when he would talk to us, he would teach us Proverbs. But every day he would get about 10 minutes into the passage and then go off on a tangent on the grammar, the Hebrew. And it was so absolutely fascinating. And then by coincidence, in second year undergrad, I had an option to take courses that were beyond the sciences. And one of them I took was the biblical Hebrew course. My parents will remember. Taught by an Afro-Canadian gentleman, not Jewish, but taught us the rudiments of the biblical grammar from a Christian theological view. And it opened my eyes to the way that you can look at the Bible and the text in a very different way. And there were certain verbs in that he interpreted differently. And I remember writing them down and running to Mr. Burke when we had some days reading week. We would run back to there and say, Mr. Burke, we were heard from this professor that this is what this verb meant. And he looked at us and said, well, that's one way of looking at it, not the way he would. But there were alternative ways. I mean, here was somebody coming from a non-Jewish background, teaching me what I had been indoctrinated in for years in a much different light. And it was one of the most interesting courses I've ever had. And it was just piqued my curiosity. So we're talking about mentors. Sometimes they're not Jewish mentors, sometimes not from the Jewish context, but people outside, some from within the sphere of what I was taught and some from not. So I think it's, as Mike said, being humility and having the ability to realize that other people know a lot about the scriptures from a different vantage point and respect what they have, learn from them. And it's just expanded my knowledge. And when I hear Michael with this lovely Torah reading, I'm going, gee, the way he emphasized that word, that's what what's his name would have said is probably the right way to pronounce it, because that's what the pronunciation is supposed to be. Anyhow, I'm just saying that that's part. I have some other anecdotes, but Mike, from you, who are your?
So I love that appreciation of grammar of Mr. Burke, because I remember his voice. He had a very characteristic voice, and I was inspired by another one of the teachers of chat, who dealt with scientific understanding of events in the Bible. And that was Alex Groper, who just recently retired. He's really the one who turned me on to archaeology. And I fell in love with archaeology. He had a certain way of connecting with students and his approach. And it's no coincidence that he lasted, I wouldn't say lasted, thrived as many decades as he did in the teaching profession, not just at Czech, but in other places as well, because he was greatly appreciated. And I feel fortunate to be among those who had the opportunity to learn with him. And one aspect of what Stephen mentioned before, when you say, somebody tells you, you can't do this. So I call that the Dafka effect, where you say, Dafka, I'm going to show you, yes, you can. So I recall after high school, when I was deciding where to go, and I went, my mother, she took me to the Department of Archaeology at the University of Toronto. And we met with the department head, we set something up in advance. And I met with him in order to find out what opportunities were out there through archaeology. And to make a long story, no, to make a short story even shorter, he said to me, the department head of archaeology, I don't recall his name, he said to me, well, to be honest, there's not a lot of opportunity in the field of archaeology. If you're looking, maybe some research, but if you're looking for work, there aren't a lot of things to do with Canada. And of course, I wasn't thinking at the time necessarily where I'd be going with that. I was hoping that I would meet somebody that would continue the inspiration that I'd drawn from Alex Grover. And it had the opposite effect. And I didn't follow up with archaeology at U of T, but I think it was because of that Dafka, as well as Alex Grover, that eventually, after being in Israel for a few years, that I had the good fortune to be accepted into a tour guide course. And one of the elements that I truly fell in love with there was archaeology in the field. So there I had a chance to explore the Bible from a completely different perspective than only, of course, the text of the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh itself, but to see things as interpreted by a variety of different archaeologists from different backgrounds in terms of their relation to the Torah, and try to see what those things meant, what those fantastic stories and places we read about in the Bible, what do they really mean when you see them in situ, in the site itself? The imagination required and developed by reading the text and looking at a site, and whether or not it occurred there actually, or whether or not it actually occurred, was not so relevant. But the ability to associate the land with an event and description of the Bible was for me just phenomenal. And having gone through that course and even before, I fell in love with Israel. And I should attribute part of that, of course, to my father, Alav Shalom, who was in love with archaeology from an early age and went to Israel a number of times on his own, without my mother and without family, to attend archaeological tours, and came back and infused me with that excitement about Israel. So it's no coincidence that Alex Grover became the next mentor for me with regards to archaeology. And one other mentor I would mention while we're talking about that, mention my father. And if we speak about mentors in a broader sense, I need to attribute a lot to my parents. They both did their most, whether intentional or not, just through their lives, through the way they lived their lives, to suggest curiosity. They explored many different things. Of course, they had their opinions and set ideas about certain issues with relation to Judaism and Israel, but they infused in me a curiosity. And my father offered the environment, which was open and supportive of exploring anything based on that curiosity. And my mother's approach was more Socratic one, where you need to live and examine life. So go out there, my father allowed me, explore what you want. And my mother said, examine it and understand what it's about beyond the experiential. Try to get to the basis of what those experiences, what those things mean that you experience in your life, whether Canada or elsewhere.
And actually, gentlemen, that leads right into my next question. Please share with us your teaching philosophies and how your learning merges into the teaching that you do.
First of all, Mike picked up on one thing. And, oh, by the way, I see you really dig archaeology.
Better he said than.
See how many people. I have to also, my parents, bless them, are here, and I have to acknowledge that they were the ones who chose Associated and allowed me to go through chat, and it's given me the tools. I must say, you don't always agree with what you were taught and that, but I had some fantastic teachers, but by putting me through chat, it's given me the tools to allow me to do what I can do. I can read Talmud, I can read Rashi, I can read all the text. I understand the Hebrew, I understand the grammar, Bivot, and so on. I mean, it's just, I would not be able to do the talks and the Jewish connection with these various subjects if I didn't have that background. So I think I have to, at all my Shabbat study sessions, I've always acknowledged their foresight to have us go through chat and to come out of it at the other end. And every decade, I appreciate it more and more because as I learn more and more, it's because I had that background to do that. So you're talking about teaching styles. In the early 70s, I was a teacher at a Hebrew school, a community Hebrew school. But some of you may not know is I was also vice principal of the school for 3 years. And this was the largest independent private Hebrew school in North America. It was called the North York Community Hebrew School, run by a husband and wife. He happened to be a superb educator. His name was Samuel Klosky, Alav Shalom, and his wife, who didn't have any educational experience. The two of them from their house ran the school. And at one point, they had 650 kids in 25 classrooms, and was housed at Fisherville High School, which is just up in North York. And it ran for 3 hours every day. And to tell you the quality of, every Sunday. So every Sunday, they used to test kids coming from other schools, including Beth Baker. None of the kids from the other schools could pass their final year at the end of the year exams. They had these standardized tests every year, and the kids at the school had an average of about 75 percentile, but the kids who came from other schools, none of them ever passed these exams. So it was a very high quality. The people who taught there were mostly kids who were in my peers from Chat who taught there. The reason I make the point is that I learned how to teach kids, but also how to deal with the teachers, because as vice principal, I was responsible for the curriculum. And we had to develop curricula because Sam, whilst he was the principal, didn't know Hebrew well. He knew some of it, but he knew how to teach and how to train you to teach. And from that experience, that's where I got the confidence to give talks with people, to stand up in front of the class and teach. And for me, the way I teach our residents, some of it's surgical. We have to kind of coach them through surgical steps. That's a different type of teaching, but I always do it in a systematic way because of what I learned from there in terms of how to get messages across to young kids up through teenagers. There were actual grades there that were teenagers that we taught, and I had to know how to engage them and how to keep them interested through various media. That was at the time, we didn't have computers, of course. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the ways that I learned how to teach, was how to have a presence, how to keep the ball going for 3 hours, to keep these kids engaged. And keeping people engaged even as adults is the way that I always want to try to do. So that's one of the experiences that I had. That, I've always been thankful that I had that experience. And my sister Ellen took over as vice principal for me, so it was in a family event there. And Mike, for you, I'll let you take over from your experience.
I actually taught there also 1 year. So
Did you?
yeah. I didn't make it to vice principal. I think in terms of a teaching philosophy, we can call it that. I would say that for me, the essence of teaching is something that's done in steps. And the first step for me is the preparation. Just as Stephen mentioned before, in order to teach, you need to be able to learn. And in order to be educated, you need to teach. Because the greatest education is having to teach someone else something. If you can't explain something in a understandable manner to someone else, then you don't fully understand that issue or that concept. Whether it's math, whether it's theology, whatever the subject may be. In order to educate yourself, you have to take on the task of teaching, whether you like it or not. And I don't know when you developed your facility and joy and level of comfort of getting up in front of a group, that's something that took me a long time. I was the shyest of kids. I dreaded getting up in front of a group and speaking, let alone messing up at a piano recital. But I learned to appreciate that because of my love for learning. I came to understand that in order to get to the most effective and highest level of learning, I needed to learn how to teach things. And so I don't remember what age I was when I taught at that WASB school, probably 15. But I remember, I'm not sure.
I was the only one ever taught here.
Maybe 16, maybe 16. But I recall at age 14, beginning to work with kids in preparing them for the bar of mitzvah. About a year after I celebrated. I don't know what chutzpah I had, or who was foolish enough to engage me. Maybe they knew my parents at the shul, but and I found from that experience and some very difficult experiences, because what does a 14 or 15-year-old know about how to work with in some authoritative manner with somebody who is 2 years their junior? They know nothing, and I knew nothing. And through that experience, as difficult as it was, I came to understand the value of finding a way to engage people and encourage them to appreciate education, whatever that education may be. And I think for me, if I were to try to define beyond that anecdotal basis, a teaching philosophy, and not always successful, admittedly, is to ensure that there is that curiosity that I feel among others, that they feel that they're only getting a taste of what the potential for what that specific issue is. And what I found the most rewarding, in addition to preparation overkill, that often what I prepare, I probably use somewhere between 30 and 60% of that, and often even less. And I know, for example, in the sessions we sometimes have here on Thursday morning, when we're studying the Parsha, part of, I think, the effectiveness of teaching is to go with the flow of the people with whom you're engaging. It's a little more challenging if you're in a school that has a set curriculum that you need to cover. You don't have a lot of leeway. But in other areas, because I rarely found myself in a formal environment, because and probably just for that reason, because I don't want to be held to a strict curriculum over which I have little control, and I'm probably not being fair, of course, to teachers who work in that field. But for me personally, and I can speak for anyone else, I've always enjoyed the freedom and the ability to, if somebody changes the subject, then to go with that, if it has some relevance for the rest of the group. So while wanting to cover and to address a topic, whether it's with Stephen here tonight or in any other encounter with an audience or with in dialogue with others, for me, it's important to have that ability and that sense of freedom, as diluted as it may be, to be able to change the topic and to go with the flow if that's the right thing to do at the moment.
If I just pick up, I'd like to say that some of my mentors have been the audiences that I've engaged with. And I'm going to say two things. Number one is that there are a lot of very bright people that I have the pleasure of interacting with, who some know more than I do, let's say about a certain topic or a certain aspect of the topic. And I think the people that some of my best mentors were the people who said, I don't know, when we asked them a question. Rather than trying to fill in an answer or jump around or try to invent something, they said, I don't know. That piques my curiosity, or our curiosity. But I must say, as Mike is saying, that I think that's a given. Whenever you're giving a presentation to an audience, there are going to be people there that are going to challenge you and think of something that you hadn't thought of, or some aspect of an issue that you necessarily want to address. Saying that might take you a little different direction, but which actually helps me learn when they respond and give an answer or comment. And I think that having that interaction with the audience is, for me, the best pleasure. I don't like giving out going for an hour. The least pleasurable for me is giving an hour dissertation on something, which we do in our major lectureships. But when you interact with groups, because we learn, and Mike will substantiate that, but we learn as much as, you know, we're giving back to an audience. And just reminds me that I think Judy or one of you actually had a question. I think we didn't want to make this a monologue or a duo monologue, but it was a question, or did you want to do that at the end?
Want to do it now or at the end?
Yeah, there was one of you raised your hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'll make a statement. I'll give you a couple of examples. I won't speak very long. In my opinion, education and educators have failed. In other words, the world is not better off than it was 20 years ago or 100 years ago or anything like that. There's something that is missing. What's missing? What I've seen in the last, thinking about it, all of a sudden, a view of what gives me concern. Mount Meron, to Bishvat, 4 Orthodox boys beat up the security guard because they heard him speak Hebrew. He kept yelling at him, I'm Druze, I'm not Hebrew, I'm not Arabic. Example 2. It was the plague, the COVID situation. Orthodox rebelled against the order to wear masks. One of the images on TV was a very pleasant, good-looking young yeshiva boy coughing in the face of a security guard. Number 3, we have an election in Toronto, and they're arguing that there's more damage in the schools because the kids have less respect for the other people, beating up, knives and things like that. So something is missing. Do you have any comments?
Want to take that first?
So I'd like to hold, we're not going to ignore your question. I just want to hold off on that until the end. I thought it was going to be something specific to what we were talking about. So we'll come back to that question. I just wanted to continue our dialogue, if that's okay. We'll just put it off for a moment. I just want to say that Stephen, I think, acceptably and appropriately interrupted me before. There's an expression in Tehillim, attributed to King David. It says, "Mikol melamdai hiskalti." I've learned from all my teachers. And there's an expansion of that in the Talmud, in Masechet Makot, which says, I've learned from all my teachers. I've also learned more from my friends, and I've learned even more from my students. And there's another phrase attributed to Ovadia Bertanura in the 15th century, who says that I've learned so much, even from those who are younger than me. Tamim, he refers to them. And yet I have never feared for my honor. And for me, that's an incredibly powerful statement about, and in line with what Stephen mentioned before, the potential, the humility of being able to learn from anyone. Everyone has something that they can teach you. It may be something that's distasteful. And there was I don't know, have any of you seen the series, The Diplomat? So there's one scene there where somebody who served as an ambassador gets up in a speech, and his message is, you need to talk to everyone. And he lists, I won't go into it, he lists every outrageous partner for dialogue that you can imagine. Everything that would be the last person you want to speak with. But the power of this thing, you gotta speak to everyone. You gotta be willing. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. Doesn't mean you have to sit with them for an indeterminate amount of time. But you need to be able to talk with them. And in order to talk with someone, it's not talk to someone, it's talk with someone. It means you have to listen to them as well. And so we can learn from our students, we can learn from kids. I say, and I say it with the utmost sincerity. When I work with B'nai and B'not Mitzvah students, I learn an incredible amount. Every one of those students teaches me something. Teaches me something about being open to approaches that suit their needs and not my convention. And that is something that we need to be able to do. They may not have knowledge that they can impart to me, and they may, but they can teach us something in our interaction with them. And we have to be willing, if you don't have interaction with others that are different from you, then you're losing an incredible amount of potential of learning things, not just in terms of knowledge, not just about culture, but about human dynamics. How do you cope? How do you manage dialogue with somebody that you so vehemently disagree with? You can learn a lot about yourself while doing it. That's part of education as well.
So to sum up your reflections, would you please take a moment to explain your learning styles and how this guides your research and accumulation of knowledge?
Right back to the very beginning, curiosity. And Dwight Francis will verify this, but those of you know, there's an old expression that you all, some of you will know the baseball player Yogi Berra. Do you remember he had all these isms, Yogi Berra isms? He said deja vu all over again, things like that. It ain't over till it's over. We also have an expression called if you see a fork in the road, take it. And I take both forks in the road. I'll go down. My poor wife has to coax me out of my study. I go down what we call rabbit holes, and down deeper and deeper and deeper, and keep moving. And it's amazing. You get researching things, and you just keep going and finding new things to go. Then I'll back up and go down the other fork. So he was right. Both forks in the road, and that's because I want to see, different aspects of things, and it just burns my curiosity. But I must say, that learning style, not only do I get lost in a kind of nerdy way in some of the things that I like to do, I just like to get to the depth, the bottom of the topic. And again, not just from what Michael was saying, you want to research it well, and at least go as far as not that you're authority on something, but at least that you have the richness of the elements that are there so that you can make a coherent and understandable thesis on what you're going to talk about based on the knowledge that you have. Again, admitting that other people may have other approaches and have other knowledge that you have to be open to. But I just like to try and thoroughly research things, but go down rabbit holes of things that I'm interested in, which piqued my curiosity from way back. Some of the things I've investigated and presented to you online are things that piqued my curiosity 50 years ago. They wouldn't talk about that. Well, I'm going to find out why. I'm going to find out the why. The why is the other thing, curiosity, the why. And a lot of it comes from a lot of the, like I say, a lot of the secular things that I've read. So my learning style involves, as Mike intimated, is learning beyond the Jewish sphere. We have to know the Talmud, you have to know the core of the Tanakh, of our Bible, and the Hebrew. You have to know the Hebrew well, but you have to also know what's outside in the world. The rabbis from the Talmud all had, outside interests. They all had knowledge of other things. And when you read through the Talmud, it's surprising just how much other knowledge they incorporated it into the decision making. There's Greek words that show up. I mean, they knew other languages. I think that's part of this, understanding other languages. And I've always been interested in linguistics and other things. So, so my style is to learn things that I'm curious about, but try to delve into it to try and get deeper into the subject and take those forks in the road, take both of them and see where it takes me. And it sounds very philosophical, but that's the way I do it.
So I take some of my inspiration for, I guess, a learning style, if you can call that. From the beginning of this week's Parsha, we start to read from the book of Numbers, Sefer Bamidbar. And it's interesting that the opening verse uses the same thing by Deber, Adonai, and Moshe. But then it goes on giving a ton of detail, which doesn't happen. The phrase is usually by Deber, Adonai, and Moshe Lemor. God said to Moses, saying. This one gives the place where it was, the specifics of the location, where God spoke with Moses, the date, where they had come from, way more information than one needs. And I would not attempt to unpack all that for you now, with the exception of one word. It talks about God speaking to Moses in Midbar Sinai, in the desert or the wilderness of Sinai. And just last week, it said God spoke to Moses Behar Sinai, on the mountain. And the word Bamidbar is a fantastic metaphor for where learning and conversation and dialogue can perhaps best take place. Because the root for Bamidbar is the same as the root for Ledaber, Dvar Torah, Dover, spokesperson. This is inspiration from Mr. Berger. And the place where you can best speak with someone and listen is where there's the potential for silence, where there is the potential for exposure. There's nowhere to escape. There's nowhere to hide in the desert. You're there. When you speak, there isn't dissonance from conflicting or competing voices. Yes, there may be an odd hyena or something, but what you say, you have to be careful because it's going to be heard in the most effective way possible. And when you're there, you have the ability to listen to what's being said in the best way possible as well. So in terms of a learning style, as awkward and challenging as it sometimes is, I believe we need to, and I try to do this intentionally, put ourselves in awkward, humbling situations. Because what you're going to learn, if you want it to be as effective and deep and layered and encompassing as possible, it's not just picking up knowledge. It's experiencing the educational process by exposing your vulnerability. And the desert is the place to do that. I'm not going to go out in the desert and do that, of course. But it's a description of where and how we need to take on education. If you go into education thinking, and again, it comes back to this issue of humility and curiosity. If you go into an educational experience or process thinking, well, I'll listen to what they have to say, maybe 5% of it might be worthwhile, but I'll show it. If you go in with that approach, you're not going to learn as much as you can. You have to go in there feeling open, like the wilderness, to that experience, and learning to be comfortable in your awkwardness of ignorance and lack of knowledge and lack of experience. And that's not an easy thing for most of us to do. And I won't say it's easy for me, but I've said to many of you on occasion that I enjoy those awkward conversations. And believe me, that was not me as a kid or as a teenager. But I actually embrace having awkward conversations and discussing difficult things because I feel exposed and therefore open to learning where I wouldn't be if I'm closing myself off and not exposing myself emotionally or otherwise. When you do that, when you expose your vulnerability, the depth of education is far more meaningful and impactful than if you go in there feeling safe, fortified, and protected. And that's not an easy thing to do. And I'd be a fool if I said that happens every time. But that's what I strive for, because I feel that's could be the most effective educational experience of all.
I just want to actually show that there's one mentor that I didn't mention. Was a mention. They Albert Kraft, rabbi here. And my dad will attest to that. We used to take classes with him. He used to have, like Rabbi Schein has had. Rabbi Patlin used to have private, educational events where he used to cover, I remember Ricky Watt and some other aspects. What I learned from him was the openness to many interpretations. Because again, I was at the stage there, I was in high school at Chat, again, with a very sort of narrow focus in terms of Jewish practice and Jewish belief. He actually opened, because he was an Orthodox rabbi who was embracing this kind of conservative movement and coming to grips with it himself and leading a congregation that was on this sort of side of Orthodox. He taught us how open it is and why he believed that we could go to a conservative side that he was comfortable with. And that was very open. Here's a rabbi who was trained as Orthodox, who was teaching us in a style that was open to different interpretations of various Talmudic passages, various religious practices. And he said, we're taught this, and he said to Stephen, you're probably taught that at Chat, but there are other ways of doing this. There's other ways of looking at it. And my dad was with me through some of those classes. Dad, if you remember, back when Rabbi Patlin gave us those, they were like small group teaching. And he was a mentor that I always appreciated. And, when you get them on one-on-one, they just give you a lot of very rich alternatives from their experience and their training. So we can learn from people in all different walks of life who are open to the same thing that you were mentioning.
And just one last comment, very brief. One of my mentors, the reason why I'm able to support this curiosity and learning, because my partner is the same way. That's something that we share. And she does an incredible amount of research on things having to do with health and nutrition, etc. And one of the things she just brought to my attention was a study that was done on why do we need to keep learning? Why do we need to keep doing new things? Because they found a study that forgetfulness, loss of memory, is not something that's supposed to happen. It's not a natural thing that happens, that should happen in most people. But what causes that? This is, of course, a recent study. They call it pruning of the brain. What does that mean? It means that you prune away at a certain age, most people in different ages in their lives, all the new things that you don't want to take the time to learn or readjust to. So you tend to stick with the familiar, and both in terms of your activity, in terms of your emotional experience, you tend to stick with these same familiar, safe elements. And that's what prevents the brain from retaining its sense of memory and its effectiveness. And of course, there are other reasons for that, not just that, but this is something that fascinated me, the need to continue to learn new things. That is what keeps us healthy, active, and it keeps our minds active as well. And many of us here have seen enough what happens when people begin to lose cognition for different reasons. But if there's a way, if there is something that can mitigate that, about preventing it, but that can mitigate it for later in life, why not?
Thank you.
Everybody more, I'd like to acknowledge one more member. That's my wife, Frances, who has put up with these rabbit hole investigations and that has been encouraging throughout, and who has taught me a lot about life over 45 years. So couldn't do what I do or enjoy what I do without her. And love you very much. And she's my longest term and most impactful.
Thank you so much, because that's really why we are here. And we wanted this to be an integrated program as well. So if we can entertain the first question and the questions as we go along.
So I'm happy to respond to what Norm's asked before, commented. I don't think that Stephen or I would disagree with you that that's the reality today. And part of the reality, I think, is due to the fact that people are not sufficiently curious or humble, because they are convinced that their view of the world, if not the only one, is certainly the right one. And unless you're willing to acknowledge that there are other ways, and this applies to all sides in any encounter between different cultural, religious, political groups, if there isn't the willingness to acknowledge that people have different perceptions of reality and what should be the way of the world, you're going to get that violence. You're going to get that lack of respect. Lack of respect stems from a lack of humility and a lack of curiosity. And if we can find ways to promote and inculcate those values in kids at a young age, then we have a good chance of lessening the type of violence that we see today. Whether that's possible or not, I don't know. But that's my understanding of why this is happening. People are not willing to see and recognize alternatives to their faith.
I mean, I don't know how you break through that. You've lived in Israel for many years. How you break through that, I guess, code of, say, ignorance or intra, whatever it is, I don't know what the word is, but when people are introspective and don't really interact with the community around and open their minds to alternatives, then you get these hardline attitudes that are perpetuated over generations, and you get these attitudes that you just, as Mike's saying, can't get a dialogue to enable this to get past it. So I think it's a very difficult problem until there's an openness to other alternatives and other philosophies. I think this is going to be very difficult.
I just want to just add one lighter thought on this topic. When we think that we know everything and exhausted knowledge in a certain issue. So there's a story of a little girl who thought that she had exhausted mathematics when she had learned the 12 times tables. So when her grandfather said with a twinkle in his eye, "What's 13 times 13? She turned on him with undisguised scorn and said, "Don't be silly, Grandpa. There's no such thing."
You heard about the two invisible parents, about the two invisible parents?
No, tell me about that.
Well, the kids were not to look at it either.
Gary, do you want to shout it out?
Stephen, when you were going through chat Friday night, you and your fellow students used to go to some rabbi's apartment and meet. And how did did you consider that a good part of your education?
It was good. It was Rabbi by the name of David Rubin, and he lived within walking distance of us, and he used to have a newspaper there. I've been for a couple of years, and we studied the Parsha of the week. But I must say that as much as I enjoyed him, I don't know how much he actually stimulated me in terms of the curiosity and ongoing self-learning from there, because it was very traditional, the same as we did at chat. We had the Parsha, we did the Rashi, we did the Ibn Ezra, we did all the commentators, which was very good because you become more and more adept at reading it and understanding yourself. But I wouldn't say that it expanded my horizons. Not as much as when I left chat and started looking into all of the questions that had been posed in previous years that were never answered. That's what stimulated my curiosity. much more than the rote kind of teaching, which just continued what we were doing that week when I looked, back at, what he covered. So he was a wonderful teacher, and he was a very, very kind gentleman. But I think that people, as Michael was saying, where you want to learn new things, where you want to go and see it from a different perspective, it didn't give me that spark. And so I can't say that I learned a lot of new things from those experiences compared to what it was once I left.
Very interesting. Other thing you want to add, please?
Just a brief anecdote on a spark of a different nature. I remember after I became bar mitzvah, my brother had already been, and I've told the story to some of you. My brother had been reading Torah at a shtibel run by Rabbi Schucht. I don't know if anybody remembers that. That was on Waterloo and Bryant.
Just for concept, this is not a man. Shalom is his father, his late father, Doug Bear, who was a teacher of mine associated. So it's the
Waterloo and Pope. It was in the basement. And one week my brother couldn't make it. And here I was, I thought I did a great job on bar mitzvah reading Torah. I think it was age 14. I think I started as the first student. So hey, I know everything there is to know about reading Torah, right? I went in there on that Shabbat, and I talked before about awkward and humble. Well, this was beyond humble. This is what's called humiliating. I was corrected every little thing that I mispronounced, whether with the music or with the accent, or God forbid, a word. I was shredded to pieces that day. And my brother asked me when we came back, so how did it go? But
come a long way.
But I will say that 2 months later, when my brother wasn't able to do it, he asked me if I would go there again. And I said, yeah, you know what? I'm going to go back. And I won't say that I did a pretty good job. It certainly wasn't perfect, but it was a healing experience. I don't know if I thought of it in those terms back at age 14, but I felt the need, having been humbled by my own inadequacy, to go back and try to do something and do it better. So when we talk about a learning style, and I mentioned embracing awkwardness and humility, I wouldn't consider that's the term I used back then, but I felt some need to repair what I had done, to try to make up for that missed opportunity and improve. And I think that essence of improvement is part of a learning style as well.
You got back up on the horse.
Yeah, you got it.
You've got to do it. Yeah, you've got to do it. Do we have anybody else who has some curiosity or wants to share something? Question?
Too soon now on Fridays, but I think you do share the two of you some really exceptional that you sort of stated, but it came out in a very natural way, not as one of the founders, which I think that a lot of people like you to start from is parents who have already before, but even by the time we got to school, have not exactly paved the road, but we started to take the road, and that's an important thing because other people don't have it to start to get even more inside them. And to me, super important. No, it's not just curiosity. Excitement is a very excitable nature and passionate. And the other thing I could never figure out, sorry, is why in the world the House of Shammai is still continuing. And I don't have the answer to that because the other thing that I did read once was that at some point, study is not just so many questions. It's an exercise, not to get to the answer, but just for happiness, like the angels. And then one of them also said that you could argue, and I don't remember which one, but that's a problem when you get old. Because the excitement and the passion is still there. You see, like, who said what? And you get confused. But I think I'm one of the older people. Oh, that's but the two people that one of the rabbis said, we don't both know, that, and I have two wives. He had the young wife and the old wife, and the young wife was speaking out of the white ears, and the old wife was speaking out of black ears, and they ended up husband involved. So but that's true. I mean, I don't know if it's actually true. Well,
Thank you.
My question on there, in there, especially the one also, we have a example, maybe for the is that? He is, who is the wise one, is the one who learns from all other people. Stated right there, so that's one some of us teaching philosophy is not just learning on your own. Well, these are the targets.
Is there a curiosity in the room, another question, or we're good? Well, then Michael and Stephen, downright curious and inquisitive. In other words, a philomath, always looking for ways to improve experience. An epistemophile, loves knowledge. An autodidact, a self-taught person. According to Albert Einstein, we need, according to Albert Einstein, we need to learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. The important thing is not to stop questioning. Interesting that he humbly admitted that he had no special talent, but that he was only curious. And these gentlemen have illustrated to us, and I quote, never stop learning because life never stops teaching. In gratitude of your participation here tonight, a donation has been made in your honor to the Engaging in Education Fund to continue to share enlightening programming. Thank you so much, and we know that this was great. Thank you so much for joining us and wanting to learn, and please continue to nash, sit, chat, and inquire. Thank you so much for doing this.
I wanted to ask what's your next one?
I'm thinking of one that I've got put together, but there's some good things in the life. One of the the last 45 years. So I'm going to tell them what I've been up to. Oh, but I got a lot of different things. Well,
During the day?
like on Thursday mornings, I'm working too, but it's recorded. So that